Hello and welcome to UnHerd. I'm Freddie Sayers. Happy 2023 to all of you. Over the Christmas period, one thing became very clear, and that is that Elon Musk is now surely the most talked about person in the world. His pronouncements are now pounced on every single day by supporters, detractors alike. Dare I say it, no one since Donald J. Trump has shown quite the same flair for saying things that put him at the center of the story. His takeover of Twitter seems somehow incredibly significant for our culture and so much more than just a business transaction. Well, one person who spends a lot of time with him, they appear together on podcasts sitting next to each other, but also was a co-founder alongside him of PayPal back in the day, is David Sacks. He is now, of course, a big Silicon Valley figure in his own right, general partner at Craft Ventures and host of the smash hit podcast All In. He joins us from the Bay Area to help try to give us some better information than just the rumor mill on what the atmosphere is really like and what he thinks it tells us about power, politics, technology, maybe even the future. So, David, welcome back to the show.
Good to be here. Good to see you, Freddie.
As I said there in the introduction, you, unlike so many of us, actually have proper information about the atmosphere, what is being talked about in the room, and what the kind of vibe is around this extraordinary Elon Musk takeover of Twitter. What should we know that we don't know? What is the mood in the room?
You know, the mood at Twitter, I think they are kind of heads down now and working on product development. You know, the things that people talk about outside the company, it's 95% about speech debates. That's maybe 5% of the conversation inside the company. And the other 95% is just building the product. How do we make this better? How do we ship more features? How do we get more efficient as a company? The company's been losing a lot of money. We're probably going into a recession. So there's just a lot more focus on Twitter as a business. And that's really what people are talking about at that company, as you might expect, like any company. It's just that what the outside world wants to talk about is like a very small portion of the issues that Twitter has to deal with.
What should ordinary people understand to be, do you think, the kind of motivations for this transaction? Because there's so much conspiracy, there's so much bad information out there as to what Mr. Musk is actually trying to do, why he would want to buy this platform. As you say, the business case is a bit shaky at best. What do you think the mission really is?
Well, I think Elon's been very clear and explicit about that. He wanted to buy Twitter to restore its proper place as a free speech platform, as a marketplace of ideas, as opposed to a place where the debate is heavily censored. And it's turned out that it's been even more heavily censored than we possibly could have imagined. Twitter for years had been telling us that they were not engaged in shadow banning. As it turns out, they were. Even worse, they were doing so at the behest of the US government. They're very deeply intertwined, the relationship between Twitter's trust and safety and the FBI and the intelligence community. I mean, really stunning revelations have come out in the Twitter files. So, Elon stated what his objective was, which was, again, he's motivated by free speech, and it's turned out to be an even bigger issue than maybe we even knew at the time. So I think in general, what you see is what you get with Elon. I mean, he states what he's trying to do. There's no mystery about it. And the one place where I would maybe disagree with you is I think that Twitter can be a great business as well. In addition to fixing the censorship issues, I think it can also be a great business because they simply haven't done very much with that product. I mean, the product simply hasn't changed that much in the last 10 years. And already in the last month or so, we've seen more improvements to the product than we have in the last number of years. And I think you'll see that continue. I mean, he's some of the big things he's done already. He's already sort of right-sized the cost structure of the company. He's reduced the number of employees to something more sensible so that the company can get profitable next year.
Can I just quickly ask you about that point, because it's so interesting. Is it true that 75% of them have been fired? Do we have any information as to what number of people have actually been fired from Twitter?
Well, I think the initial reduction was around 50%. And then that was in sort of the riff. And then Elon gave the employees a choice of whether they wanted to take a voluntary 3-month severance package, which was more than he was required to do. I think that was something like 50% more than the law would require. So they could choose the severance package, or they could commit to, going back to the office. He wanted people in general to work from the office, not work from home, and to commit to kind of a startup culture. What he called kind of a hardcore, culture, just basically working hard. And he gave people the choice, and I think maybe another 20% chose voluntarily to leave.
20%
So
of the remaining 50%.
Yeah, I don't know the exact numbers. I think there's something like 2,000 or so employees. I mean, this is not like a small team. They still have thousands of employees there. And then in addition to that, they've got thousands of contractors who are sort of these outsourced agencies that all these social networks use to implement content moderation policies. So, Twitter is not short-staffed. I mean, if you were to ask the question, how many people do you really need to keep the lights on and the servers running, it'd probably be a few hundred. So again, this is not a small number of people. I mean, the reality is Twitter, like a lot of companies in Silicon Valley, was very bloated and overstaffed. And it was possible to cut, call it 3/4 of the employees, and actually improve the performance, because you didn't have a bunch of people working across purposes getting each other's way. So we're seeing a faster pace of product development now from the company with 3/4 fewer employees.
I mean, that is, or even that on its own is potentially seismic for the whole world ultimately, because of course the question in everyone's mind is now, is the same true at Facebook and Google and all of these other big tech companies, that 70% of the workforce is maybe not really necessary?
It's a great question, Freddie, and I think that question's actually reverberating through Silicon Valley right now. It's a lot of companies well beyond Twitter, big companies as well as startups, are asking the question, how many people do we really need right now? Why do we have all these people? Did we get too bloated and inefficient during the sort of boom that we had over the last few years? So I think a lot of companies are now asking that very question. And I would just say that the level of excess and entitlement that grew in these tech companies over the last several years, that was fueled, I think, in hindsight, by Fed policy, by zero interest rates and free money. It allowed this culture of excess and entitlement to kind of blow up. And I think now people are really starting to ask the question, should we, right size? And you're already starting to see now major layoffs far bigger than what Elon did. What Elon did was big in percentage terms, but already Salesforce just last week, Amazon, Facebook, they've already done bigger layoffs in terms of absolute numbers of employees.
So there might be a kind of cascading effect coming from what's been going on at Twitter throughout the whole sector, where lots and lots of people lose their jobs.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think that the tech sector is already in a major recession, regardless of what happens in the overall economy. I can tell you that sitting from where I'm sitting in Silicon Valley, investing in startups, we're already in the worst tech recession since the dot-com crash of 2000. And it does become a little bit of a vicious cycle, because if you think about it, like let's just take Salesforce as an example for a second. They, in their most recent quarter, their growth slowed down by 2/3. So now, last week, in order to keep their unit economics in line, they did this huge layoff. That means that they're going to be cutting their purchases from their vendors, and then those vendors are going to have to cut costs. And so one of the things that we've happened in software over the last decade is we've had this huge tailwind of what's called seat expansion, which is customers just kept buying more and more seats from their software vendors to basically provision new employees. But if the number of new employees is shrinking or just freezing, then all of a sudden seat expansion could turn to seat contraction. So we're already seeing that a lot of software companies are really feeling this bite right now, and it's a larger problem in the tech economy.
So in a way, part of me feels strangely positive about that, because it feels like there's a moment of reality that somehow over the last few years we've been getting used to something that wasn't real. And this is an unfortunate, painful bloodletting, but in a way it needed to happen, and maybe something better can grow out of it. Do you share that? Is this a necessary period of pain, or do you think it's just bad news for everybody?
It's probably both. I mean, I think it is a necessary period of trying to right size all these businesses and get more efficient, because things were overheated, valuations were far too high, companies were burning too much money. There was, again, too much hiring of a necessary role. So This is a necessary correction, and these things do need to happen once a decade or so. That being said, it is a very painful period, and it's not a lot of fun to go through as either an investor or as a startup founder. So necessary, yes, but regrettable at the same time.
Do you think there's politics attached to that, that somehow, and this might be a leap too far, but somehow that sense of being comfortable, that sense of kind of relying on these very big structures, including proximity to the government, fed into a slightly left-leaning political outlook, and that more entrepreneurial or business-focused mindset was dropped, and that there might be a kind of accompanying political shift to go along with this dose of economic reality?
Well, I think there are some big political and cultural ramifications to what's happening. I do think that, like I mentioned, there was this sense of entitlement that built up in the system, and you ended up with a lot of, you could call them surplus elites, people whose sense of status and entitlement was greater than the real economic value. And I think one of the reasons why there's been so much hysteria about what Elon is doing at Twitter is he's really cut to the core of the insecurity that a lot of these surplus elites feel, which is Elon is saying that, listen, your job here at this company is not based on what your politics are. It's based on what your contribution is and what, and I think that a lot of people built up an expectation that as long as they had the right views and associated with the right causes and the right people, that they would have continued economic advancement. I mean, the person who actually summed this up very well was SBF of the FTX fraud fame. He said, this is the dumb game that we woke Westerners have to play. We say the right shibboleths so everyone likes us. And I think there was a sense that that game has been played for a long time by a lot of people. And Elon's actually changing the bargain. He's saying, no, it's not based on what shibboleths you buy into. It's based on what economic value you provide. And I think that is sending shockwaves through the system. And I think it's a big part of, again, the hysterical reaction that you see.
It doesn't make you think that sort of peace and calm is ahead of us, does it? Because if you've got all these many thousands of people, the surplus to requirements people, they're still pretty powerful. They might have just lost a high-paying job in a big tech company, but they still have networks, they still have assets. We're a sort of class of surplus elites who are now going to be increasingly angry and possibly more radicalized is being created. What happens to them? Where are they going to go? They're going to be politically activated, and you kind of fear that an almighty culture war is coming down the road.
Well, I mean, if Twitter's any indication, they already were very politically active. So, in fact, what we basically found out is that Twitter had the equivalent of several NGOs working inside the company whose job was basically to restrict content and censor the other side of the debate, the part of the debate they didn't agree with. And they were doing so in lockstep with various government agencies who were far more involved than we ever thought possible. So I tend to think that the politics was already there. It was on overdrive, and what's being part of the correction now is bringing things back to some sort of economic reality.
Do you feel like, and this again might be a difficult question for someone who is a Silicon Valley investor, but do you feel like part of the problem was just the scale, and that what has happened with those technology companies, because they've all become so global, they somehow became ossified into some kind of big elite-facing huge behemoths that ordinary people began to really resent because they were far away, and whether you agreed with the rules or not, they were being set sort of beyond comprehension in some distant land. Do you think that Twitter just got too big? And a lot of these companies have similarly got too big, and maybe part of the formula is smaller, more variety, more competition, more local. Do you think there's any truth in that?
Well, I think that they clearly got too big in the sense that they're not as economically efficient as they could be and really are going to need to be to survive this coming tech recession. I tend to think that a big part of the problem, though, is that they were applying rules on their users and on society and really on our democracy that were not transparent and that people never agreed to. Remember that Twitter's previous management told us that they were not engaged in shadow banning. In fact, they said that under oath at congressional hearings. And what have we learned through the Twitter files? We've learned that not only were they engaged in shadow banning, they called it visibility filtering, same thing. They had elaborate Big Brother-like tools to be able to throttle the amount of traffic that any particular account gets. They could do things like hide you from search, hide you from trends. There was a do not amplify setting, and so on. And so it went. There were these like checkboxes they could simply apply to an account to sort of put their thumb on the scale and make sure that they didn't get as much traffic as they would have in a fair system. And so not only did it deprive those users of their right to speak, it deprived the public of their right to listen and hear those people in the way that they should have. And so a good example of this was Dr. Jay Bhattacharya at Stanford, who
we had him on the show last week.
Oh yeah, great. I mean, he was one of the early critics of lockdowns and pointing out that that policy would not be effective, and yet his traffic was throttled. He was basically shadow banned. I think we're still getting to the bottom of why, whether that was done at the behest of government agencies. It seems like there was a deeper problem there that we should get into. But that's one example of where I think the public debate was really warped by the fact that Twitter's censors were indulging their personal biases and also working on behalf of government agencies that were involved in the public debate in a way that seems completely incongruent with the First Amendment. The idea that we had something like 80 FBI agents involved in flagging posts for Twitter to take down. And then the FBI was acting as a conduit for the intelligence community and a bunch of other agencies, acting as what the head of the FBI field office in San Francisco said was the U.S. government's belly button. They were kind of like the centralized point through which all of these requests were delivered. I mean, it's really quite extraordinary. No one knew this was going on, and no one would have known this was going on if Elon hadn't bought the company, because they weren't telling us, and in fact, they were lying about it.
Do you feel it would be fair then, if we're thinking about what's happened since, you were just talking then about Twitter 1.0, let's call it, the era since Musk, Twitter 2.0, it's very different, but it's not exactly neutral, is it? I guess the lie or the pretense of Twitter 1.0 was that this was a neutral platform, whilst we now know, but I guess we suspected before, that it wasn't, and there were political leanings, there were fingers on the scales. The Musk era is not exactly neutral either, because it's now ultimately controlled by one man who is very explicit about it. He has a whole lot of opinions. He shares them on his own platform every day, and they're political and they're strong. So he's not pretending to be neutral. I just wonder what your thoughts are on that. You could see a different way this might have played out, where he would buy it and be kind of ultra careful to appear neutral. That's definitely not what's happened. He's very much saying, I control this and I have strong opinions.
Well, so I think you're conflating two different things. There's sort of neutral in terms of the application of your content moderation policy, and then there's neutral as a user. Elon clearly has opinions and he tweets about them. He did that before acquiring the company. I think he loves using Twitter. It's probably one of the reasons why he bought the company. Was it the old Norelco guy said, I love the product so much I bought the company. So yes, he hasn't stopped doing that. Does that mean that he is implementing his own personal ideology through the content moderation policy? I would disagree with that characterization if that's kind of where it's going. Right. And I know that this charge of hypocrisy has been leveled at Elon because he's made a few content moderation decisions. But I think the real hypocrisy has been on the part of the media, which for years was cheering on censorship. They were cheering on the deplatforming of a sitting president, for example, the deplatforming of thousands of people they disagreed with. And now, whenever Elon makes any content moderation decision, they basically are up in arms, acting like they're free speech absolutists. I think that's where the real hypocrisy is. Elon never said that he was going to abolish content moderation. I think he has tried to keep it pretty neutral and fair, and I'm happy to drill into any of these issues if you want to go further.
For another one at you, David, which is another one of these kind of tricky questions, which is what the policy should be on something like health, because we've covered the pandemic probably more than many channels. We broke the Great Barrington Declaration story here at UnHerd, and I hope we've done our bit to even up the scales a bit on that discussion. But ultimately, with something like health, I guess there has to be a policy. You can't have anyone saying anything about any medicine, or maybe you should have that. Where do you think you would draw the line? And clearly, they went beyond it in suppressing the speech of highly credentialed professors like Jay Bhattacharya. But what do you think the line should be?
Well, I think that we should respect science. And I think the thing to understand about science is that it's a process. It's not a specific set of views. It's a process for reaching an outcome. You set up hypotheses and you test them, and then you get results, and then you adjust your hypotheses, and you get to the truth in an iterative way. And I think that part of being a marketplace of ideas is you let that iterative process function. And I think the problem that we saw is that with Twitter 1.0, they thought they had all the answers. And moreover, they appear to have been working with various kinds of government agencies to say these are the only correct answers. And they were entirely wrong about that. I mean, they were wrong about lockdowns. They appear to have been wrong about vaccines in certain ways. We were originally told that if you got the vaccine, you wouldn't have to worry about getting COVID, and that turned out not to be true. And now there may be other things coming out. So I think this idea that we have all the answers and we could just prematurely end the debate, that the danger in that is that it empowers the Trust and Safety Department at Twitter, who evidently can be leaned on by government agencies who are very powerful and have control over the company in various ways, to prematurely end the debate. And so I think that the experience of COVID should teach us that that's just not an appropriate role for a social network to be involved in, which is trying to resolve, I'd say, scientific debates or really hot button political issues where the outcome is still very much in debate.
So to take an extreme example, if someone wanted to go on Twitter and say, I believe that MMR vaccines are extremely dangerous and are going to harm your child and are going to cause autism in your child and the rest of it, should that be allowed?
I think Robert Kennedy's doing that right now. So the tangible question is, are you going to censor Robert Kennedy? I mean, why? I think let him present his case. And if his case is weak, it should be easy for the scientists to rebut that case. But I don't think that you improve the situation by censoring him, because what it does is it breeds mistrust. If there are people out there who want to understand either the efficacy or the risks of vaccines, they should be able to go research the issue. And if you're censoring one side of the debate, they're not going to be able to do that. Let him present his best case, and then let the people who are on the side of vaccines present their best case, and we will get to an answer. And I think that process will be healthier than trying to pretend like we know all the answers in advance. And this idea that we can get to that answer without the process being hopelessly politicized. I think what we've learned from Twitter 1.0 is the process does get politicized, because as soon as you create that power, we're talking about the power to censor and declare the truth and end the debate, there are too many interested parties who want to usurp that power and use it for their own ends. And so we saw all these powerful interests in the US government reach out and lean on Twitter. And initially Twitter resisted, but eventually they caved and gave in. And so that power to declare what the truth is got usurped by these sort of nameless actors, hidden actors in the sort of permanent government. So I think, when you start to act as a censor in that way, it leads to this cascade of all these dangers. And to me, that's a far riskier situation than allowing there to be a free debate over vaccines.
So we are, if we think about what the effect of that would be philosophically or on the whole of society, it feels like we're quite far down a change process between a world where people just bought into an outlet and just trusted everything that outlet said, towards a world where every individual is basically being asked to make their own judgments about everything. And, no outlet will say there's no misinformation, there's nothing necessarily true or false here. It's creating a more individualistic society, I guess, where we need to be more vigilant all the time and make our own decisions about what we think is true or not. Do you see what I'm getting at?
I do, but it seems to me that that free speech was widely accepted as the principle until quite recently. And if you go back even 10 years, it was a bipartisan consensus. Both Democrats and Republicans polled in huge numbers, they supported free speech. This simply wasn't a politically controversial issue. It's only in the last decade, roughly, that this idea that we need to empower centralized authorities who are influenced by the state to regulate the public discourse in order to protect the citizens from themselves. This is an entirely new idea that's really emerged in the last decade or so, along with sort of, what Elon's called the woke mind virus. So I think what is being advocated here is maybe not a fundamental change, but really a restoration of the situation we had just a mere decade ago, which is that we had a relatively free marketplace of ideas, and people could go research an issue and find the information and make up their own mind. It's only recently that, again, we have this this movement towards censorship that, again, we now know is a version of state censorship. It's not just big tech companies doing it. It's an alliance of big tech and state actors, and that's the incredibly dangerous thing. And one of the things I've called for is a new church committee to investigate the question: why is it that the U.S. security state was deeply involved in censoring the free speech rights of American citizens? We really need to get to the bottom of that, because that is the anomalous thing that's happening here. That's the anomaly. It's not this idea that people are trying to find answers on their own. I would argue that was the situation we had before this.
I guess it was just built on a bedrock of trust in institutions and enough of a sense that there was like a common society back then that I'm just less confident the new world still exists.
Well, I think you're right that one of the big dynamics that's happened in our society is that there's been an erosion of trust in what you could call prestige media. If you look at, they do these polls, I think Gallup does, on institutional credibility, and the prestige media is just rock bottom. People feel like it's biased, it has an agenda, it's lying to them, and I think that, unfortunately, that distrust is well earned. I think that people are realizing that the prestige media does have a significant bias to it, and they're looking for alternatives. And this is why you're seeing the rise of independent media. People watch this podcast.
Yeah,
exactly. So I think UnHerd is a big part of that. So people are thirsting for answers they cannot get from the traditional media. But I think that it's traditional media that squandered its credibility, and that's the fundamental issue. That's what's created this need for alternatives. Does that create a breakdown in some sort of consensus? I think it creates a breakdown in the prestige of these traditional outlets, but I think that we will, on the other side of this, get to a better place than we would have if we just let these prestige outlets dictate the truth to us, because I don't think they can be trusted to always know the truth.
So do you think, I guess there's some hope in what you're saying, which is that it feels like you think we could get to a better place, and that would look like a new set of institutions, do you think? Do you think it's a new set of media outlets, it's a new set of accompanying institutions that are recommitted to an earlier principle of freedom of thought, freedom of expression? Or do you share, we had Dave Rubin on the show, I think it was last year, and he was very much like, he's just given up on what he thinks of as, left-leaning prestige institutions. He just wants to build alternatives now. So do you think a neutral prestige establishment will ever be found again?
I think that's a great question, and I'm not quite sure how it's going to play out. I think you're going to see the creation of more and more independent channels, and at the same time, you might get a reformation, maybe, of some of these prestige institutions. I mean, I think both efforts need to happen.
Let me take it back to Mr. Musk for a second. And do you share any of my concern that some of his kind of quick fire, just putting all of these ideas out there, endangers that more neutral or more free platform? Because if he says very provocative, partisan things on it, as he's the figurehead, if you don't agree with him, and if people, of course, are entitled not to, they will fear, rightly or wrongly, that somehow his influence is, infecting the rules or the way that,
Right.
and they will go elsewhere. And we've already seen a bunch of progressives saying, Twitter is dead. I'm going to leave Twitter. I know that not that many of them have at this point, but do you think that there's any danger of that by being too out there, too partisan, he's going to imperil his own project?
Well, I could flip it around and say at least you know what his political views are. At least you know where his bias is coming from. Because what we saw from the Twitter files is that these Twitter executives, they may not have been stating their bias, but they clearly had deep biases. In fact, they were, in the case of the suppression of the Hunter Biden story or the deplatforming of Trump, I mean, there were internal debates showing that under their current policies, they could not make those decisions to ban that story or that president, and yet they twisted those policies to find a way to do it. And then they were presenting those decisions to the public as neutral content moderation decisions. Oh, they broke our hack policy rule in the case of Hunter Biden, or Trump broke the incitement policy. And the truth is that they didn't. I mean, regardless of what you think of that story or Trump, they were not in violation of the rules. So listen, I could flip it around and say, at least we understand where Elon is coming from. Now, as to this question, are people going to leave? There's been this, again, total hysteria on the part of the sort of this prestige media in terms of the changes that Elon has made. And we can never forget the night of November 17th, is the week before Thanksgiving, when Goodbye Twitter was trending. Remember this hashtag? All the sort of liberal pundits on Twitter were predicting the site's imminent collapse. I think an MSNBC commentator had said that the servers were about to go down because Elon had fired so many people, and they were all tearfully saying their goodbyes. And it was like this liberal rapture where they're all like, I will see you in the afterlife on Mastodon or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, it was this ridiculous outpouring of total panic and hysteria. And we're now almost 2 months later, and the site's up and running just fine. So there have been, Freddie, every couple of weeks there's a new panic about what Elon is doing to improve the company or right-size the cost structure or allow free speech, and every time it's proven to be baseless.
The other factor in all of this is the big money companies, the corporations. Because in theory, you could sort out a perfectly fair or whatever you think is the right policy on content moderation, but if they're not going to provide the advertising dollars, that is going to be a problem for the company. And a lot of these big money corporations also take a very political view of things. And if any voices inside them are worried that something is a dangerous environment or doesn't sit with their community values or whatever, they will pull advertising from it. And I know that there's been a drive to try and get advertising dollars away from Twitter. What's your view of that? Do you think that is a problem that can be overcome?
Well, one of the few content moderation decisions that Elon has made, I say few because he's really kept the prior content moderation policy in place. He hasn't really changed it that much yet. It's just that he's calling for it to be applied in a even-handed way. But in any event, one of the few decisions that he's made was basically banning Kanye when he posted a swastika inside the Star of David. And so there's been no tolerance for hate speech on the platform.
Just to interrupt, sorry, I don't like to interrupt, but does that mean you support that decision to ban Kanye?
I think it's a practical decision. I mean, Freddie, listen, do I support the Skokie decision, the Supreme Court decision? Yes, I do. Can you run a social network based on the Skokie decision? No, you can't. It's just not practical. No one wants to log into Twitter and see their content appear next to a swastika, and advertisers certainly don't.
If I remember correctly, the rationale for banning Kanye was incitement to violence.
I think there were like five different.
Right.
I think there's like 5 different reasons you could ban Kanye.
Strictly speaking, even horrible as it is, a swastika inside what was it again? I can't even remember, but it was a very unpleasant image. is not necessarily a direct incitement to violence, is it? You could see how someone might take a different view.
I think that Kanye jumped the shark on his third name change. I think his name is Yitler now. So, I mean, look, I think there were multiple reasons you could ban Kanye. I think it's for his own good, to be honest. But I think, look, the point is that there's all these critics of Elon who have suddenly become free speech absolutists who want Twitter to now apply, I guess, the Skokie decision and allow swastikas everywhere. And, if the worst thing you can say about Elon's content moderation is that he's cracked down on the posting of swastikas, especially inside of a Star of David, I mean, isn't that a good thing? I mean, but this is kind of where we are in the debate, is that all of a sudden these people who never had a word to say about the banning of Trump or the banning of Jay Bhattacharya or the shadow banning of Jay Bhattacharya and thousands of other people that they disagreed with, they were perfectly fine with that situation. And now all of a sudden they want to defend the right of Kanye to post swastikas on Twitter. All I can say is welcome to the free speech movement. I think this is great. Let's have that debate.
But it sort of exposes the lie of the idea that there is such a thing as a perfect free speech or there is such a thing as perfect neutrality. Ultimately, what we've done is we've just swapped one powerful entity, Twitter 1.0, for a different one, which has a different perspective, has drawn the line in a slightly different place, still will ban things that he finds sufficiently unpleasant. And isn't that really the reality, that there's no perfect free speech, but also there is no such thing as perfectly neutral. And we've just swapped one perspective with its own biases for another that may be better, but it's not just a biased perspective.
Well, I think this curation is better. I mean, I think what we're saying is that social networks should not be banning users from participating in a free marketplace of ideas on hot button political and social topics like COVID, and all the other things that people got banned for. However, you're not going to be able to post swastikas inside the Star of David. You're not going to be able to dox people or on a continuous real-time basis. You're not going to be able to impersonate people. This is the other thing that they were up in arms about. Remember when Kathy Griffin got banned? She was impersonating people and then posting fake political endorsements. I mean, if that's not election disinformation, I don't know what is. So, these are reasonable content moderation decisions. In my view, free speech never meant that anything goes. And even if you look at Supreme Court case law, the First Amendment does not mean anything goes. The Supreme Court has created at least 9 categories of speech that it considers to be dangerous and therefore not protected by the First Amendment. I think it would be good for social networks to ground their content moderation policies to the extent they're able in First Amendment case law. And I think you can do that to create a little bit of a neutral authority. I don't think it's going to be perfect because, there are specific requirements that social networks have. You can't subject every content moderation decision to a court level of evidence. We're not going to have a trial, over billions of tweets every day. We can't do that. So we're never going to be able to apply a First Amendment standard. But, can we look to Supreme Court case law, hundreds of years of it, to try and ground content moderation decisions in something neutral that everybody respects? Yeah, I think you can do that. But look, it doesn't mean that anything goes. And this is the dilemma is, on the one hand, you got people criticizing Elon for creating an environment that supposedly isn't conducive to advertisers. And then on the other hand, they're criticizing him for banning doxing, impersonation, and swastikas. So what's it going to be? I mean, you can't have it both ways. I think that he has taken a reasonable down the middle approach towards content moderation. We're not going to ban Jay Bhattacharya, but, sorry, we're not going to allow Yitler. So, I mean, that's kind of where we're at.
I noticed you used the we pronoun there. Obviously, I have to ask, I've just been throwing questions at you for 45 minutes, almost as if you were in charge of Twitter. And any short list of potential CEOs includes you. If you were so asked, would you take the job?
No, I'm not a candidate. And I should clarify, when I say we, I say that as someone who supports these decisions. So I'm defending them as somebody who believes in the correctness of the decisions that are being made. So
Is that a definite no? You would absolutely say, I completely ruling it out?
Yes. No, I'm the key man at Craft Ventures, so taking an operating job is not in the cards for me, nor is it something I want to do.
Do you think he will step down though as CEO, like he did promise after that Twitter poll?
Um, yeah, I think that at some point he'll find the right person to appoint as CEO, and I think that he'll step back into some sort of chairman role or something like that. And
But
I
no,
think it'll be.
there's no timeline as far as you know.
I don't know of any timeline now. So I think he's got to find the right person,
Can you?
and I think he's also. I also think that he's got to finish making this round of changes that he is making, because I think that only Elon can do this. I mean, again, in something like less than 2 months, he's been able to go in and right size the company by something like 75%. I think that he's already gotten product development moving. I think that he's made some important course corrections on censorship, and I don't know that anybody else could have done what he's done so quickly. So I think he's got to get through. My personal view is that he needs to implement his plan, and then I think he could bring in a CEO to help run the company.
Will you speculate with us? I mean, after all, it's a free world. We're fans of free speech here. Are there any names that we should be thinking about as potential CEOs when that time comes, do you think?
No, I don't know. I mean, I really don't. The person who's worked very effectively with Elon over, I guess, a couple of decades now is Gwynne Shotwell at SpaceX. So, I don't know exactly what Elon needs at Twitter, but if he could find someone like a Gwynne Shotwell, I think that would be great.
Final speculation for you, and then we're going to let you go. Fast forward 2 years' time from today. Do you think Twitter is a growing, profitable company? Or do you think it will be seen as having had crises and will be still in some negative situation?
No, I think it'll be. I think that it'll be profitable, and I think the product will be far better than it is. I mean, 2 years is a long time at the pace that Elon is moving. I mean, Elon is moving in kind of like dog years pace. So 2 years. I mean, look at what he's done in the last 2 months. So I think the product will be different, and I'd say radically better. I think it'll do a lot more. I think you'll be able to do a lot more with it. And I think he'll have fixed the problem of the company being massively unprofitable and losing billions of dollars. So I don't know what the numbers will be, but I suspect that he'll have it at least at break even by 2 years from now.
David Sachs, thank you for your extremely optimistic and positive chat with us.
Thanks, Freddie.
That was David Sachs, a close friend of Elon, the founding partner of Craft Ventures and a co-founder of PayPal, giving us his take, admittedly, through a very pro-Elon perspective. I'm sure he would be happy to concede that, but one that has a lot of insight and a lot of information about what's really going on in Twitter. Let's just hope that he doesn't announce he is the new CEO next week, because then this show will have got it wrong. Thanks to him. Thanks to you for tuning in. This was UnHerd.